Welcome back, ECO736 students. This is video 3 for week 4, looking at measurement of poverty and inequality. Back to FGT measures. We now continue with the poverty gap ratio, also known as your total poverty gap, which is denoted by P1. So your alpha in this formula will be 1. This is basically the sum of the difference between the poverty line and the actual income level of all people or households living below that line. Remember, it's below that line. An advantage of this measure compared to your P0, which is your headcount ratio, is that it actually reflects the depth of poverty. We are now starting to consider those who fall below the poverty line and how far away from the poverty line they are. A disadvantage of this particular FGT measure is that it is not affected by redistribution amongst the poor and the severity of poverty. So it doesn't increase to a large extent the weight of the poorest, not to the same degree that P2 does. And also, if amongst the poor themselves there is some kind of distribution of income, that change will not be reflected in your P1 FGT measure. Looking at your P2 FGT measure, also known as your squared poverty gap ratio, this is a very sensitive measure to depth as well as the severity of poverty. So it really gives the greatest or attaches the greatest weight to those who are the furthest away, far more so than your P1 measure. So the further away from the poverty line a household or an individual is, the greater the weight assigned to that household. A difficulty with this measure is that it is rather hard to interpret on its own compared to something like the headcount poverty ratio, where it's very easy to imagine what, say, 50% poverty looks like. Well, that's half of your particular society that falls below a poverty line. With the P2 measures, it's only helpful in terms of interpretation when you are comparing it between different societies. Something else to note is that all FGT measures are additively decomposable. That means beyond simply calculating the poverty measures for the whole society, you can also calculate FGT measures for different subgroups, like by race, by gender, by geotype, and all you need to do is just use the population share of that subgroup as the weight, and you can continue using the formulae. Okay, next up we are just going to look at a practical example to make the FGT measures very clear in your mind. Over here we are looking at a small society of 10 people, which is from people A person A to person J, and we line them up from the person who earns the least to the person who earns the most. In this particular example, we will use a $10 poverty line. So if you wanted to calculate P0, which is your headcount poverty ratio, you know what the formula for that is. Go back to your previous slides. Well, you should come up with an answer that this society has a headcount poverty ratio of 40%. Okay? And how did you get to that particular answer? Well, let's look at everyone who falls below the $10 poverty line. In this society, there are only 4 people who qualify, persons A to persons D. Okay? And all of them earn below 10. Person E is not poor because they fall on the poverty line. Remember, we only care about those who fall below the poverty line. Now, remember earlier when we spoke about depth of poverty, severity of poverty, one of the disadvantages of P0 was that it assigns equal weight to all of those who fall below the poverty line. It doesn't care about how deeply poor they are or how severely poor they are. And this is seen by the fact that each poor individual over here person A, B, C, and D, they contribute exactly 25% each to this index. Okay, so there are 4 people in total who are poor, and each of them contribute equally, so that's 25%. The same weight is attached to each poor person. We don't attach more weight to person A or less weight to person B. Next slide. There we go. Now, if we want to look at the poverty gap, that is the gap from where you are at in terms of what you earn to what you need in order to at least sit on the poverty line. For person A, their poverty gap is $8. This is the poorest individual in the society. For person D, their poverty gap is $2. The total poverty gap in the society is what? Okay, the total poverty gap ratio is 20%. Go back to your formula for P1 and do the calculation. Now, let's consider how much each person contributes or what their weight is towards this index. So in the previous example, each person was weighted equally. They each contributed 25% towards the headcount ratio. It's slightly different now with the poverty gap ratio. If we look at person A, for example, they contribute 40% to the FGT P1 measurement. Okay, person A's poverty gap is $8. The total poverty gap is $20. How did I get this $20? It's 8 plus 6 plus 4 plus 2, right? So 8 over 20 gives you 0.4, which is 40%. Can you calculate person D's contribution to P1? Well, if you got 10%, that is correct. So clearly you can see now we are starting to consider the depth of poverty, and you will see that person A has a slightly larger contribution towards this index than person D, which is only 10%. If we look at the squared poverty gap ratio, where we are now squaring this difference between actual income and the poverty line, we are now attaching an even greater weight to those who are further away from the poverty line, even more so than just your P1 measure. So if you go back, or if you use this formula for P2 with all the necessary inputs, you should get an index of 0.12. Now, we want to know what person A's contribution is to this specific index. And if you did the calculation, you should come up with 53.3%. If we compare person A's contribution to the P2 index with person A's contribution to the P1 index, you can see that it has increased with P2. It's 53.3% for P2 and it is 40% for P1. So with your P2 measure, your P2 FGT measure, it is attaching more weight to the poorest person in this particular society. Over here we have another example of a hypothetical society with 10 people who all earn a specific household income, and where you need to calculate P0, P1, and P2 when we tell you that there's a poverty line of 460. So I'm sure you can do this on your own, in your own time, easily. Another way of describing poverty in society is to decompose it by socioeconomic or demographic characteristics, and you can also do this using your FGT measures, because we did say it's additively decomposable. So all these variables here, province, gender, race, etc., if you do a lot of descriptive statistics of poverty by these variables, you start to get a more granular idea of what is happening in particular societies when it comes to poverty. Moving beyond simply your uni and bivariate analyses, you can also do multivariate analyses, which will allow you to measure the exact contribution of various characteristics or various attributes to total poverty. There are some limitations of poverty lines. Measuring the appropriate poverty line, setting a poverty line too high. We deal with an approach next week called dominance testing. This approach makes the use of poverty lines redundant and is a useful tool to have in your kit when it comes to looking at poverty without necessarily using a poverty line. If you think back to the very first slide on poverty and measuring poverty, I expressed the difficulty when it comes to measuring poverty because poverty in itself is multidimensional. So there are other indices which try to be more comprehensive in how it looks at poverty, and one such index is the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI. You can go to the OFI website to check out more information on it. But basically, your MPI, it tries to identify poverty status through a dual cutoff. And the dual cutoff considers not only money metric poverty, but also other dimensions of poverty, such as health, education, and standard of living. So this slide basically just deals with the health, education, and standard of living indicators and how they are calculated. And over here, we've got a ranking of countries according to both MPI as well as poverty headcount ratios. And if you spend some time to analyze it, you will see that understanding or measuring income poverty or money metric poverty is not enough if we all agree that poverty is multidimensional. We need to start bringing in other indicators as well to get a more comprehensive idea of what is happening in different countries. I look forward to our discussion on Thursday in our Canva chat room. Please ensure that you read through all of the prescribed readings for this week according to your reading assignments. Make sure you read the Thorbeck handout specifically, and come with your questions as well as your answers. Remember, those of you who simply greet, you will not get marks for participation. You need to also be willing to engage and offer answers to questions that arise. Otherwise, all the best with this week's reading assignment, and we will catch up again on Thursday.